Hi everyone, my name is Alex Logan. I'm today going to be breaking down round two of the BP Nationals tournament. This house prefers media portraying marginalized groups as thriving as opposed to portraying them suffering. So I'll start with a bit of an introduction to myself and then I'll get into the motion breakdown. So my name is Alex, like I said, I'm from Burnaby, British Columbia. A little bit about my debate experience. I've been debating ever since grade six, all throughout high school. I am currently a senior at the Ivy Business School at Western University. So was debating for a really long time, took a step back a little bit in university, but still involved with coaching and a little bit of judging here and there. So, a little bit about my debate experience. I was a two-time member of Team Canada throughout 2020 and 2021, as well as the 2021-2022 school year. I also participated in BP Nationals, just like you guys, ever since grade 9 until grade 12. I won it in the junior category and came second in the senior category, and that qualified me for Oxford schools, where I was the top speaker as well. So, done a lot of debate, a lot of familiarity with BP and specifically the Canadian circuit as well. So, I'm really excited to break down this motion for you guys. Just in terms of what debate means to me as well, I think debate is really two things to me. First is it's been an incredible community. The relationships and friendships that I made from debate have stuck with me for my entire life and genuinely, I think, have given me some of the best support structures for my university life as well as my career life or throughout high school as well. I think a lot of my friends were from debate and I really appreciated that. And I would say, secondly, as well, just the skills and general information that I've learned about the world from debate is unlike any other activity I've ever done. The public speaking skills, the ability to think on your feet, all really, really helpful skills that I've gotten from debate, and they've helped me throughout my, personal, educational, and professional career as well. So, with that being said, we'll hop into breaking down this motion. Just as a caveat, these are kind of my initial thoughts on the motion, just based on a quick brainstorm. But obviously, these aren't the only arguments that you can make, or maybe even not the best arguments that you can make. Just my personal thoughts on the motion, and hopefully, this will help inspire you or maybe confirm some arguments that you ran in your debate as well. So before we move on to specific sides of the motion, I think it's always helpful in these media portrayal slash message motions to think a little bit about what this debate is about and what both sides look like. I think broadly, when we think about portraying marginalized groups as thriving, it's probably specifically selecting maybe certain stories of marginalized groups or a general portrayal that they are doing well. Perhaps that's because they are wealthy, perhaps they are just happier in their own lives, and those sorts of narratives, like the narrative that like you can make it out despite all these barriers. Looking at individuals like Obama, for example, as like big trailblazers and showing, despite all the barriers that he faced, he was still able to succeed and thrive. I think that second part, emphasizing the barriers that individuals have overcome, is particularly important for proposition, which I'll talk about a bit later. And I think, secondly, when it comes to suffering, just portraying them as needing our help to some extent, going through a lot of different types of anguish and showing a lot of potential structural barriers that might hurt these individuals from being able to succeed. Okay, so now I'll take a look at the Gov case. So I think there are really two general ideas that you can run on Gov, or that I think are probably most relevant to this round. The first is this idea of generally why you get better advocacy for change from a political or societal perspective. And second is why, on an individual level, just individuals from marginalized groups will feel better about these narratives broadly. So I'll beginning with the first general idea on advocacy for change. I would say that there are a few reasons why suffering perhaps would not be a good way of advocating for the change that opposition might desire in this debate. The first is that generally people do not want to see negativity on their screens. And often the natural reaction to seeing some sort of suffering is to potentially turn off the screen or look to a more positive type of message from your media rather than go towards that negative message. The basic reason why here is that these stories are potentially not as feel good. people don't feel as nice about themselves when they view this suffering and might view a lot of these messages as just kind of depressing media fear mongering rather than something that they should actually listen to. And that's why, for instance, a lot of people during, let's say, COVID or different types of crises often will turn off the TV, not look at the news, or try to ignore and block out what's going on in the world. I think a similar argument can be made here in terms of suffering compared to thriving. The second is that even in the best case of opposition, where individuals view these marginalized groups as suffering and broadly see that they are suffering and register with that, there's a leap that opposition has to make, which is portraying them suffering necessarily leading to people helping them. And I think that's often not the case for a few reasons. First is often, even if you are suffering, people will say that you deserve it, that your group is inherently inferior in some way. For example, look at how a lot of poor individuals that are seen as suffering or homeless people on the street are often viewed as somewhat inherently inferior or that they are lazy because they got there, which is often a very prevalent narrative in our society. The second is that capitalistic systems on both sides still exist, right? On both sides, there are incentives for corporations, which have a large amount of control over the media and also general narrative power, as well as individuals who want to work hard and you climb the corporate ladder, for example. They all have incentives to perpetuate this narrative that you suffering is often due to, for instance, maybe your individual fault. And there's largely also a lot of status quo bias that might prevent you from changing these systems, even if they are discriminatory towards certain individuals. So, for instance, perhaps there are incentives for bosses of corporations to not implement certain standards or regulations on, say, taxation, because not necessarily because they don't know that people are suffering, but just because they personally have interests in things like wealth. And I think lastly, you can make the claim that even if you view these people as suffering, there is a very fine line between seeing them as suffering but being able to be saved or being able to be supported versus just thinking the problem is too far gone. And I think that is often likely as well, right? You might view these people as suffering too much and therefore think that regardless of what action you take, that these people will just continue to suffer, and there's kind of a sense of learned helplessness there as well. When it comes to the thriving message, I think there's a couple of potential reasons you can give for why this is a relatively better message. So the first is that in contrast to suffering, which is more of a harmful, or not harmful, but not as a feel good message, something like thriving is a lot more of a positive and inspiring message where you can see someone has climbed the corporate ladder despite a lot of barriers, for example, or won an election despite a lot of discrimination against them. And I think that's far more of a inspiring message that might resonate a lot more with individuals and generally means that you just get more attention on these marginalized groups. Now, opposition will obviously say, well, that attention is not going to be good attention. So I think you can broadly say that overall, this means that if you have more attention, even if the majority of media portrayals are on these marginalized groups thriving, individuals can still speak about the barriers that they had to overcome in that process and still demand some degree of change towards those barriers. In fact, you could argue on proposition that this gives more power and more airtime to people like, for example, prominent business people from minority backgrounds or politicians, like I said with the Obama example. And so this might, in fact, be a good thing because it means because you have more airtime, these people can speak about their issues in a digestible and understandable way for the population. I would say, additionally, right? You can, even for the people that are suffering. So even if you are not one of the thriving individuals, now there's no longer that sort of inherent your fault narrative with that. So if you are suffering, it is likely not necessarily because poor people are just inherently lazy, for example, or that people from a minority background are inherently lazy, but rather that there is some sort of problem with the system that prevented you from being able to climb those ranks. And so you can no longer make those sort of broad sweeping generalizations about groups of people. And so it's more likely that, again, you pay more attention to the systems and see, okay, it's not the individual's fault that they're suffering. What exactly are the reasons for why they're suffering and why aren't they thriving? And I think you can generalize that far more and then take a look at general barriers as opposed to individual faults. I would say, lastly, is that when you portray marginalized groups as thriving, it's no longer this sort of helpless narrative that, like, regardless of what we do, they'll still be suffering. But rather, there is now an actual benefit of changing power structures and those sorts of things and implementing things like regulations, because now you can directly see, okay, well, actually, these people can do very well for society. It's just that we need to change our structures. So, for instance, perhaps there is a story on the news about like a prominent female CEO. And now you can say, well, if we promote a woman in the workplace, there's going to be a benefit out of that, and they're going to do well in society and actually participate well. So there's an active incentive to start to do these sorts of societal changes. Okay, so I think that's broadly what I would run in terms of advocacy for change. I'll move on to the second general idea on individuals. I would say that there are two different aspects when it comes from an individual perspective. And I think the broad idea here is that individuals from marginalized groups, when they're portrayed as constantly suffering, there's often a sense of learned helplessness on their behalf, and this belief that regardless of what they do, they cannot succeed. For instance, if you look at a lot of patriarchal communities, there's a lot of existing narratives around women and their individual internalized beliefs that they cannot do anything to kind of break out and do well in the society, for example. And I think these media portrayals can often reinforce those existing beliefs that many of these minorities have, that they're to some extent helpless with their individual effort. I think this is a big problem for a number of different reasons. The first is that individuals often don't put themselves in positions of power or in the potential opportunity for a position of power in the first place. So, for instance, a lot of individuals might not even apply for a job if they think they're not going to get that job, or not apply to university or a scholarship if they don't believe that they're going to get in anyways, because they believe that they're inherently suffering to some extent and that the system is rigged against them in the first place. So that's quite harmful. I think comparatively, when it comes to a thriving narrative, you, number one, have less of these internalized worse expectations about your individual group. But I think second, this provides a lot of role models that individuals can look up to and aspire to be. And this can provide a tangible image of what success could look like in your eyes and a clear example of what thriving would look like from your perspective and from your marginalized group. Again, I think there's impacts of this. Like, number one, you just put yourself in the system more. I think importantly, right, just putting in effort and putting in that job application or putting in that university application is often a precondition for a lot of the social change that opposition will probably talk about. Because in order for people to, for example, want to demand things like social change, you actually need to think that there's some sort of a cause worth fighting for. And if people just think that individually the situation is kind of hopeless, then regardless of if you have, let's say, quotas for individuals in the workplace, or, for example, affirmative action programs in universities, if people just aren't putting themselves in that system in the first place, then obviously it wouldn't lead to any of those beneficial consequences. And I would say, secondly, is obviously opposition might say, well, because these barriers still exist, people won't succeed anyways, regardless of how much they try. But I think the point is, even if you don't achieve 100% success, you're still the best that you can be individually. So even if you don't get into the top university, at least you try and then you studied harder in your exams and got better grades, and then you're able to get into like a more mid-tier university, for example. So essentially, it's like that quote, right? Like shooting for the moon and you'll land among the stars. It's kind of a similar principle to that. So yeah. So I think that's generally what I have for the government side. I'll move on to the opposition side. So in opposition, I think the main central idea that you really want to push is this idea of social change and highlighting harmful structures and barriers to success for marginalized groups. I think the important thing to frame here is that thriving, when it comes to the government narrative, is often going to be portrayed as an individual reason for thriving, right? It was your fault, or it was your fault that you didn't thrive, or comparatively, it was you deserved your benefits of thriving, for example. So essentially, thriving is not going to highlight systematic issues with oppression or barriers to entry, for example, but rather it's going to say that if you thrived, you deserved it. If you didn't thrive, you're individually lazy or there's something individually wrong with you. I think there are a few reasons why that's the case, but I think generally the idea is that if you're someone in a position of power, you're the person that's being highlighted on government, and you also have an incentive to justify your success, to say that you deserved your success. Because if you chalk it up to some degree of luck, for example, or if you talk about, different systems that might have affected that, then that will take away from your deservedness of that wealth. And I would also just say as well, like in capitalism, because people want to incentivize you to work very hard, then there's also this incentive to portray that narrative as well. So I think when it comes to thriving, therefore, you can run a couple of arguments for why that's not necessarily very good. The first is that people are unlikely to think that there is a problem in the status quo, because if you see that there are a lot of successful groups from marginalized backgrounds, then you tend to underplay the barriers that led them to be there. And there's a lot of harmful narratives like, why can't you do it if this other person did it as well, for example. I think this is particularly true because there's a pretty harmful confirmation bias that exists here, where if you are from a privileged background, you want to hear what you want to hear to some extent. You don't want to be the one that has to support these groups or go out of your way to, for example, have higher taxation or donate to charities for marginalized groups, because that is an individual harm to you. So, from an individual perspective, if you're someone from a position of power, your gut instinct is likely to see these stories of thriving as confirmations of your existing belief that these minorities are not doing that bad and that they can just pull themselves from their bootstraps and get up anyways. So I think that's the first very harmful narrative, is that it doesn't prompt you to actually make any specific changes if you're not from that marginalized group. I think the second thing that I would say as well is, even from a individual perspective, so if you're an individual from that minority group, that this also gives power to those that are most privileged within those marginalized groups anyways. Because the people that are thriving are likely those that already had the most wealth or the most connections or the best educational background out of that minority group. And that creates a bit of a skewed distribution, because the only stories you hear about are these success stories, but those are already the people that are kind of pulled themselves out anyways, or who are already thriving, or who weren't going through a lot of the structural barriers. And so because of that bias, again, the stories that you highlight from those individuals are unlikely to be representative of all marginalized groups and are unlikely to actually cover the realistic issues that an everyday marginalized person from that marginalized group actually faces. So, sort of from an intersectional perspective, there is less attention towards these harmful issues. I'd say lastly as well, although there's a lot of attention on individuals that are thriving, keep in mind that that's still going to be a minority of cases when it comes to these marginalized groups, or at least not a large portion of cases, because they are marginalized. And so when it comes to the people that are still marginalized, that are still suffering, there's a lot of harmful narratives that come when you see these people as inferior to the people that were able to thrive, right? Narratives like, you are lazy, again, or that, it's your fault, it's on you, it's not on the system, but it's your individual fault. So I think that's also harmful, because it means that people are more likely to judge these specific groups for not succeeding. And again, there's not as much of a prompt to change individual systems, because it's rather on you as a person and your specific personality traits to make that change. I think comparatively, when it comes to suffering, I think there's a few things to note here. So the first is obviously that the media just has a large amount of influence over people's decisions, the information that they get, and the information that backs up those decisions. And I think therefore there is more of an urgency to change, or that this media will prompt some degree of change from individuals, because this suffering will often be portrayed as very visceral, for one, right? It's someone actively suffering, actively going through a harm, which is very visceral to the average person. And I would say, secondly, as well, likely prompts a large degree of empathy towards these groups, because individuals just have ingrained in empathy, both in terms of just seeing yourself and other people, being able to empathize on a very human level, but also the fact that through processes like evolution, we were all social animals as creatures, and we all thrive by supporting each other and bringing each other up. So when you see someone suffering, that's a very active and strong response empathetically to help that individual as well. I would also say that suffering is far more solutions based as opposed to looking at thriving. So when you look at thriving, individuals might talk about things like you can just work harder, for example, or I deserve the wealth because I gamed the system more than my peers. But when it comes to something like suffering, you can actively say, okay, here are the specific barriers that are the reasons why people are suffering. And here are specific policy decisions or active choices that we can make to lessen those barriers to some extent and bring people up from that suffering perspective. The last thing I'll say on opposition as well is not only do you just go more in depth into these issues, but I think from an individual marginalized group perspective, you are also more likely to fight for change when you actually think that there is a problem. Because even if proposition can say, now these people will work harder, right? That is also to some extent a harm on you as a marginalized group, because now you individually don't think that there's much of a problem either. That you think, if I just work harder, if I just do some reading of Sheryl Sandberg's book on lean feminism, then I can succeed in the job market. But the reality is that there are still a significant amount of barriers that prevent that. And so, because you as a marginalized person are kind of buying into this idea that you can just work harder, then you're less prompted to solve those issues. Whereas when it comes to seeing yourself as suffering, then either A, if you're a privileged person, you're more likely to recognize that the rest of your marginalized group is suffering and recognize the need for change. And secondly, it also means that you're more likely to, for example, show up for a protest or actively advocate for specific changes to power structures. So I think that is what I have covered for the motion, but happy to speak about it a little bit more. If you have any further questions, you can maybe reach out to me or Griffin, and we'd be happy to help. But otherwise, hopefully, if this is sent post-tournament, that you guys had a good tournament. BP Nationals is a tournament that's really dear to my heart. Again, I've attended a bunch of times. Super fun tournament. So really hope you guys enjoyed yourself, and yeah, have a great rest of your day.